Welcome back to the channel, and this series of videos capturing the strip down, refurbishment and rebuilding of a 1275 Ribcase gearbox. In this part, which is part 2 of the 3 video series, we've stripped the gearbox, so now we're going to be doing a quick inspection, replacing the bearings, cleaning up as much as possible and preparing for reassembly. So if you remember last time, we got the gear set apart. You can see here the input shaft, we've got the main shaft, lay gear and reverse gear. I bought a refurbishment kit, so that includes 2 bearings. It includes the input shaft roller bearing, a new rear seal and a new lay gear and roller bearings to support that, together with a complete set of gaskets. So this is really the minimum that you do when refurbishing one of these gearboxes. I've done some further investigation on this gearbox. It's an early 1275 kind of Midget or Sprite gearbox. So the gear set carries like an A-type helical gears. They changed to a B-type gear in the later gearboxes with a slightly different angle of helical gear, meaning that replacement of some of these parts is a little bit more difficult than if I had the later gearbox. On doing a visual inspection of the gears, the first gear looks to be in very good condition. The lay shaft as well doesn't seem to show any massive signs of wear. The only thing really that I've noticed in terms of wear is some play in the bearings. So as this gearbox is an unknown, what I'm going to be doing is replacing it with the repair kit. So replacing the bearings, the lay shaft, roller bearings and seals, and then putting the gearbox back together. We'll get it in the car then, and we'll see if there's any other hidden problems that the gear set wasn't showing up, and in which case the gearbox will have to come out again and be stripped at a later date. But I'm hoping, all being well, that's all that's going to be required. So first thing I've done here is clean the 3 main castings, the rear housing, the remote housing and the main gearbox case. To clean these, I used a combination of engine degreaser, gunk. I used heavy duty degreaser available at your hardware store, thinners, a brush and also a wire brush attached to a drill in order to get into some of the nooks and crannies. I also used a chisel together with a scraper to get the old gasket off these mating faces here. I think that's been enough, and I'm really pleased with how the castings have come up, and all the mating faces have been able to be cleaned well, and I think we'll receive new gaskets well. You could of course send the components away for industrial cleaning with some stronger chemicals or blasting type process if you really wanted something even better, but for what I want to do, I think that's a great job. So in this video then, we're going to concentrate on 3 main tasks. The first is then replacing the bearing on the input shaft and also the output shaft. We're going to be rebuilding the rear case, which is quite an easy build. It's just a cross shaft here and a slider, and also we're going to be rebuilding the remote, which is a little bit more complex, and there's a few springs and balls and things that go into that. So first of all, let's start with the bearings. Hopefully quite straightforward then. All I need to do is bend back this tab washer, holding the nut secure. Then I can undo this nut and remove that. I should be able to then remove the locking nut. It looks like there's a washer underneath that, and then I can use the puller to get between this gap between the gear and the bearing and remove the bearing off the top. So learning point number 1 is that this nut is very tight. In fact, the only way I've managed to undo that is to use an old clutch plate that's scrap, put that in the vise, put the shaft in there, and then I'm using an adjustable spanner. That's not ideal. If you have a 33mm spanner, that would be perfect. But doing that has enabled me to get enough torque onto the nut to be able to undo it. To remove the bearing then, I'm going to use a bearing separator set. Purchased this off a popular internet auction site for not too much money, so that will hopefully fit between the gear and the bearing, and as load is applied, pull the bearing off the shaft. So that's good. Just by winding in the attachment, I've created a gap here of probably about 5mm. So the bearing is sliding off. So next I can attach the pulling attachment and we should be able to just pull it off. Okay, so there is the bearing off the shaft. So we've got our new bearing here. Note the slot on it for the circlip. So the slot will always go vertically, so furthest away from the gear set. This just drops onto here, but it won't just drop on as it's a transition fit. So what we're going to need to do is do a time tested technique for putting bearings on. We're going to have to heat the bearing up in order to get it to expand slightly. I need to cool this shaft down, and then this will just slide straight over down to its stop. So in a home setting, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the oven on to 110 degrees, and I'm going to heat this bearing up in the oven to 110 degrees. I'm going to put the shaft in the freezer to cool it, albeit down to about 0, something like that. And then once this bearing is at temperature, I'm going to use some welding gloves, pull it out of the oven, and it should just drop on nicely straight down to its stop. Well, that was much easier than I thought. Just heating that bearing on, it slid straight onto that shaft, which is absolutely fantastic. So now we can put the nut back on, and that will be the input shaft ready to go back in the gearbox. So with the input shaft done, onto the output shaft. So now we move on to the output shaft, and the plan is to do this in exactly the same way as the input shaft. So we'll locate it in the old clutch plate, use that to grip it so that we can take back the tab washer, undo the nut, slide off the spacer tube, and then we'll use the puller to pull on the bearing and its housing to remove that from the shaft. At that point we can replace it. So for the assembly here, note that we've got a nut, we've got the encapsulating washer, we have another washer on top of the speedo drive, and then we have a spacer tube that comes down to the bearing. So now we can use our puller to pull this assembly off the main shaft. Okay, so the puller all fitted up, a little bit of a ghetto setup. I've had to just fabricate 2 nuts to extend and use all of my extension pieces to get beyond the length of the shaft, but we've been able to do that. So now all I need to do is tighten this up and we can pull the bearing off. So we've managed to pull the outer bearing holder off. So next thing to do is to repeat the process again to pull the bearing off. Okay, so ready to go again. This time we've got the puller just on the bearing. We've set my ghetto setup back up again. So if we start winding the pressure on, we should pull the bearing off. With first gear removed from the main assembly, then we're able to have a look at that. All of these teeth and also the bearing assemblies seem to be in good order there, so I'm not seeing anything that means that I need to take this apart further. I could be wrong. Once we put it back in the car we'll find out, but at the moment I'm quite happy to leave that be. This is important then. Looking at the bearing, you can see that the inner race is wider on the bearing that's come out of the car by around 2.5 millimeters compared to the replacements that you get. That's why with the replacements you get a shim to put on the inner race to make it wider. Although actually I'm not too happy with my replacement. There seems to be more play in the new bearing than there is in the old one. Again, lending me to think that this box has been refurbished in the not too distant past. So the old bearing looks to be in good condition, and also the shim with this particular set is a piece of pressed steel about 1 millimeter thick, so it isn't actually as wide as the gap from the inner race to the outer race on the original. So I'm going to stick with the original bearing, I think, in this particular case, and put that back in the car and see how it goes. Doesn't seem to have any damage to it. It rotates smoothly, so I'm going to put that back in and see how we go. We're going to use the same technique to put this bearing back on then. So we'll reassemble the shaft and then we'll heat this bearing up to 110 degrees in the oven, and then it should just drop straight on. So next up, we're back in the kitchen and we've got to fit this supporting ring here that mounts the bearing in the center, and we'll fit it onto the main case of the gearbox, and the circlip that goes around this groove will rest on this face here, so give it a datum to locate this in the gearbox. Again, it's another transition fit. This won't just slide neatly onto the bearing, so I'm going to be putting this back in the oven. Again, another 110 degrees, we'll heat that up and then we'll slide it onto the bearing just below where the circlip is, so we can then get the circlip on. Not worried about getting it to a particular depth, because then as it goes in I can just tap the outer edge of the bearing to get the circlip down to the face that we have here. So let's get that on. So now we've got our gear set sub-assemblies done. The next thing to do is prepare the 2 sub-assemblies of the housings, the rear housing and the remote housing. By far the easiest then is the rear housing, where all we're going to be doing is replacing the seal. So we'll be knocking that with a hammer onto the top end of the casing, and then we'll be refitting the shaft with the slide actuator here, and then using a screw to secure the shaft to the case. Then we can fit new gaskets onto these areas here, ready to go back on. Okay, so that's the rear housing ready to go back on the assembly. And there we have our finished main gear set ready to go back in the assembly. So the last piece of the pre-work is going to be the remote housing here. A little bit more complex. One thing to note is on this remote housing we don't have a reverse gear, so there's no reverse switch that goes in this hole here. Well, there isn't the hole or the piece in the casting to be able to do that. So worst case with this gearbox is you'd have to put a switch on the dashboard for the reverse lights if you wanted those to come on. Alternatively, I guess I could source a reverse switched remote housing and retrospectively replace that, as they are interchangeable. Okay, so here's all the parts for the remote housing. As you can see, quite a few little small intricate parts. Each has their own particular way of going back in and assembly. So I'm using one of the catalogues as a bible, because there's some really good exploded pictures available online to be able to do this. In terms of sequence, it's not too bad. So we're going to start with the reverse plunger. So that's going to go into this hole here, and then put the pin in to the outside of the casting. Following on from that, the shaft can be slid in through the hole. That's going to go through, and the two end units are going to go on. The thing to note with here is this shaft only goes in one way. So this piece goes at the remote end, and the big piece that sticks out goes that way because that actuates the reverse. And if you notice on the shaft, the woodruff key slot is around 90, 110 degrees or so from the through bolt hole, and in the shaft there is a cutout for that shaft to go through. So this one goes at that end, whereas at the other end the woodruff key slot is 180 degrees to the bolt, so that will go at this end. So I'm going to slide the shaft through, get these two on, make sure the woodruff keys are in place. Once that's in place, the two caps can go on the end, and from there it should be a fairly straightforward job to screw in all of the various components that go into the end. I'm going to sand down very lightly this plastic moulding that sits in the end of the actuator here to make sure that the spring can do its job and that plunger goes up and down effectively. I've had a look at this. This is actually in fairly good shape. You can buy replacements of those, but this is in good shape, so we can pop that over the end of the ball. And then to complete the job, I'm going to smear a little bit of gasket sealant around here, as I don't have a gasket for this, and then that'll go over the end of the housing to seal up that gap. At that point, the rear housing is ready to go back on the gearbox. One thing to note before I start is as the housing goes back together, I'm going to be giving all the components a liberal coat of oil with a brush, just to make sure they're all moving correctly and they've got some initial lubrication before the gearbox goes back together. So with the shaft now in place, sliding smoothly and operating as it should, next thing we're going to do then is have a look at some of the components. But what I can do now is I can fit these caps in. So I'm just going to get a socket of the right diameter and tap these in. Next is the assembly for the reverse detent. So we've got a screw that goes in here, got a ball to drop down there together with a spring. So we'll give that a bit of oil for operation. Drop the ball in, spring, and then outer.
So next up is the control shaft damper. This just puts a little bit of friction into the shaft, will stop rattle, and at best will help to keep all the gears in gear and avoid any unnecessary shifts. So this is a spring, a damper, and simply screws in here. So I'm going to give that a little coat of oil, and then we'll get that in here. Okay, and then we have a screw here to control the positioning, the change lever, so we'll drop that in there. Up at the top here we have another damper which is designed to stop any rattle with the gear lever. Looking at this, I think there used to be a spring with this, maybe a ball or a plunger, but that's since been lost. So if I can source some replacement parts, I can do, and I'll be putting those in before the gearbox goes back in the car. But for the moment, I'm just going to screw that back into here and tighten it up in its correct place. Next then, we can put the plastic plunger onto the ball here, so that's ready to go back in. Next then, we can have a look at the plunger that goes in this hole down here. So first of all, again, we can drop some oil in there. We can drop our spring into the hole, being careful not to lose that into the remote. And as I said, I'm just going to tickle this with some sandpaper just to get rid of some of the contamination that's on there, so it'll slide in the remote housing nice and easily, and we can pop that in. Okay, so that's finished remote housing. We've got our plunger in place now. That springs nicely. Underneath then, the last thing for us to do is fit this plate on here. There's not a gasket in the gasket kit that I had, so I'm going to use some Loctite 5922 just to smear around the surface to give me a good oil seal to avoid any leaks.
Okay, so there we have our finished remote housing, ready to go back into the gearbox. We can put that aside with all the other components and move on to our final build. In the next video then, we're going to be rebuilding the gearbox in its final assembly. We've got all our sub-assemblies ready here. We've done and rebuilt the remote housing, cleaned, inspected and rebuilt. We've rebuilt the main shaft, so we've taken that apart, inspected the bulk rings, the gears, the bearing, and then cleaned that, ready to go back. We've replaced the input shaft bearing here, cleaned and inspected that. We've replaced the lay shaft, the roller bearings for that, and also the rear housing. We've replaced the seal, cleaned that throughout, and got that ready for assembly. So in the next video, part 3, we'll be rebuilding the gearbox. Once again then, thanks for watching, thanks for all your comments, thanks for subscribing. I'll see you on part 3.